Think of a time when you experienced a conversation that left you with a new perspective, or perhaps an inquiry, or you might have felt that something has shifted in you after that conversation. Maybe it helped you gain a new level of clarity, or moved you to take action. That was a coaching conversation. Hello and welcome to the Coaching Conversation. This is your host, Salah Al-Laythi. I am thrilled to have with me today Cliff Berg. Cliff is an Agile and DevOps coach. He's also a former CTO and co-founder of a successful startup. Cliff authored 5 books and hundreds of articles, and he is the organizer of Agile 2. Cliff and I work together what seems like forever now, and we recently connected, and so I invited him to have a conversation. Cliff, welcome.
Thank you, Salah. Nice to be here. It's my pleasure.
So what's the story of your journey to Agile?
Well, I have a long history with Agile. Actually, I was an early adopter. When the Agile Manifesto came out, I was 20 years into my career, and I had been on a lot of projects during the 80s that were highly Agile. It really was during the 90s when things started to become kind of waterfall-ish for the most part. There was waterfall before that, but it was a real mixture of things. And, most people who knew software development knew you couldn't do it that way, so they didn't try. But during the 90s, waterfall really kind of like took root because of PMI and the drive for people to use methodologies because they wanted more predictability around software development. So suddenly you found that you had to use a methodology or you weren't credible. And that kind of drove the whole waterfall thing. And so I feel Agile is kind of reaction to that. But in 95, I co-founded a company called Digital Focus with someone, and it grew very rapidly. We ended up, by 2000, we had almost 200 people, and we built stuff. We built big stuff, enterprise, B2B stuff. And one of our best architects went to his project manager and said, Kent Beck, this book came out, Extreme Programming Explained. We should try this. And his PM, a guy named Doug, came to me because I was CTO and said, should we try this? And I was intrigued. I looked at it and I said, yeah, Jeff's smart. You're smart. Let's give it a try. And they did. And it worked out really well. And our company became an XP company. And that was, my first exposure to an Agile methodology, although back then it was XP. All you heard about, it wasn't Agile, it was XP. And then in 2001, the Agile Manifesto came out. And, by the way, back then, Scrum was like unheard of. It existed, but no one talked about it. It was really on the fringe. It was all XP because of Kent Beck's book. And then the Agile Manifesto came out, and that kind of took the whole movement, and then it became the Agile movement. And, at that time, we'd been using at my company XP for a whole year. And I was very, my whole approach to things was a very Agile approach. I mean, we had our own methodology before we used XP. It was called Valid. It was very iterative. It's kind of like RUP, but not as document heavy. It was more about, building increments. But there was a good, strong design component to it. And as CTO, I was concerned that stuff would really work because, we didn't build little websites. We built like banking systems and pharmaceutical platforms and things like that. It friggin' had to work. And so I was concerned that the Agile community was very immature and was just kind of like, oh, let's just throw out stuff out there and, let's see what happens, and I felt that there were foundational ideas that were being advocated for that were really good, but I felt like kind of the approach was very reckless. So I actually ended up reaching out to Scott Ambler because he worked at IBM Rational and he'd been doing some writing about, being a little bit more careful with Agile methods. And so I was the beginning of a relationship with him that we've maintained over the years. And I ended up writing a book in 2005 that actually took me 3 or 4 years to write. I collaborated with Peter Neumann about how you can use Agile thinking, Agile ideas, but to build things that you really trust. It's called high assurance design. And I called it design for a reason because it's like Agile design, which is not emergent. Emergent means without intention. The term emergent design is misused. It's not defined right. The emergent design is not something you want. The human body is emergent design. It's everything connects to everything. You can't change anything without causing all kinds of issues. Right. That's not what you want in a maintainable system. A design is intentional. And what happens with what people call emergent design, but it's not emergent. What happens is over time you add stuff and then you refactor refactor intentionally. You stand back and look at it and say, how can we change the design, how things connect, so that it's better. And that's an intentional refactoring. That's not emergent. The word emergence being misused. And so, design is really a core thing. And I felt like design was the thing that was being thrown out, the baby with the bathwater. It's not about code. It's about, and there's a concept in security that you cannot prove something is secure. And I'm not talking about mathematical proof or anything. I'm talking about practically, in a practical sense. You can't prove it's secure. You have to have what people call an assurance argument, and which means you have confidence that you know how it works and you thought it through and analyzed it and thought it through from a perspective of security and reliability and convinced yourself mentally that you can trust it. And then from that point, you're in a good position to be running tests, to kind of verify your understanding. But you have to have that assurance argument. And that rests on the idea that you know the as-built design. It doesn't mean you have to design it all up front. It means you need to actually have a design that the basic structure of how it works. And so design is a core thing, even with agile, if you're talking real agile, rapidly building things at scale that work. You have to be thinking about design. The design has to be agile. So that was kind of my journey. And I've been watching the arc of agile. And over years, agile kind of did weird things. And then, Scrum took over and agile became non-technical, which was really bizarre. We're building digital things. How can it be non-technical? But it became non-technical. And then the DevOps movement formed because people in the big companies that were building real big stuff that had the scale that they want to deploy changes 100 times a day, they had to figure out how to do that. And that's agile. So they developed all these techniques, and that later became known as DevOps. But the agile community was not receptive to that. It kind of wasn't interested. And so it became like a whole separate thing. But yet some of the early proponents of DevOps identified as agilists. Jez Humble uses the word agile more than 40 times in his book, Continuous Delivery. But somehow the agile community didn't really embrace DevOps. They became two separate things, which is a huge dysfunction.
I know his book, Continuous Delivery, came from one of the agile principles, as he told the story several times. So you wrote the book about design, and you also recently wrote a book about Agile 2, the next iteration. So congratulations on that new book. So what led to that? What led you to write this new book and create something almost like another manifesto around Agile 2, the next iteration?
Well, I want to make it clear it's not a manifesto. It's not a replacement for the Agile Manifesto. I feel very strongly the Agile Manifesto is treated like this biblical writing, and it's not. That's it's the misuse of it. That's putting it too high on a pedestal. The Agile Manifesto has some very smart things in it, but it's just a set of ideas that a bunch of guys wrote down over a weekend. That's all it is. And they're largely good ideas, although there's some problems. There's some problems with it, especially if you look at the principles. One problem with the values is what they came up with over the weekend. The principles actually got written by email by a subset of the group over the following weeks. My understanding is they did not achieve consensus on that. It was like they hacked out these principles over email. But it was the values that they created together in person. And the values, when I read the values, they resonate with me, but people hear this stuff differently. And today I read a blog post by a programmer who was very critical of the values because his assertion was that values kind of minimize certain things that are important, like this over that. Whereas you need balance, they're both important. You have to have the right balance. And he felt like it was also an oversimplification. As to how we got to Agile 2, I mentioned that early on, I was kind of uncomfortable with the Agile community's sort of culture. I felt that there were some really powerful ideas that we were bringing back some ideas to replace some dysfunction. In the 90s, things got really messed up. I blame PMI largely. It was that the 90s was suddenly I call it the methodology craze. And suddenly it was all about documents. And progress was measured by documents. And, it was very common that a procurement officer would plan out a project. And someone who had never built software would plan out an IT project and define, you have to have a requirements phase. And then you have a design phase. And they would contract out the requirements phase and the design phase of different companies. So one company would do a requirements document and then leave. And then the design company would have to create a design from that. And then in the third company, based the lowest bidder would have to implement. What a stupid way to do things. No programmer would ever design a project like that. But you had these procurement officers and methodologies written by people who weren't developers telling programmers to do things that way. And programmers are like, are you kidding me? Or the inexperienced ones weren't saying that because they didn't know any better. They thought, oh, this is how they do it. But people who were experienced knew that doesn't work. So Agile was like an attempt to say, all that's bullshit. Let's bring common sense back. That's how I saw Agile. But then the Agile community kind of went off the rails. The Agile community started getting non-technical. It started having this over focus on these weird kind of abstract things like team happiness, and they created their own terminology, and it just became like weird. And I felt like we were losing the value of the core ideas, and it was becoming kind of like this like tribe. And then sub-tribes formed. You had the Scrum tribe and the XP tribe, and eventually we had the Safe tribe and all that. It became so messed up. And things that were important, so like things that became known as DevOps. Oh, and Agile like kind of disenfranchised the whole design community. In the 90s, product design had become fairly mature, and Agile kind of like snipped it out of the pipeline. And because product design was not Agile, so that was an issue. But Agile didn't have an answer for how do you make it Agile. Basically, Agile just focused on the coding. A product owner or this genius product owner is going to tell us everything we need, and we'll just implement that. So like a feature factory. So it created this production mill. And people who do this well say, no, you don't do it like that. Yeah, well, that is how most companies do it, because that is kind of what it says to do. So to know better, to not do it that way, you have to read between the lines, because that is what the methodologies really say to do. Yeah. And, plus, the Agile, they left out data also. Like, how can you leave out data? And by the way, there was an Agile methodology that did talk about data. It was feature-driven development, was big on data modeling, but it didn't get any traction because no one created a certification for it. So it kind of fell by the wayside. The other Agile methodologies didn't talk about data. So it's very common today that development teams will build stuff and not create any data models or anything. And they'll use NoSQL databases, and they'll deploy stuff. And then you end up with a data lake, which is really a data cesspool. I have a friend who just left a job. He's a machine learning expert, and he worked at Walmart, and they hired him to build some machine learning models, and he couldn't because they have a data cesspool, because all these microservices are broadcasting, pumping historical data from transactions into this data lake, and he couldn't make heads or tails of it. To be able to train machine learning models, you have good metadata that explains what everything is. So you can match up, okay, the stuff over here relates to the stuff over here in this way. Yeah. If you divide it up into different domains, like domain-driven design, you really have to have data architects who model that, or it's useless. It ends up being garbage. So Agile has left out data and design, and Agile really kind of left out the whole topic of leadership. Like the Agile Manifesto sort of refers to leadership in two ways, self-organizing teams, and then it says trust us to get the job done, which kind of implies autonomy. And servant leadership and autonomy are kind of important things in Agile. And those are very valuable ideas. But if you take them to an extreme, it doesn't work. For a team to be autonomous, no team in an organization is completely autonomous. It's not black and white. It's a matter of degree. And if you start out with the premise, we're going to have 50 teams and they're all going to be autonomous, you'll have a mess. You'll be like 50 cats. You have to have leadership that is orchestrating, asking questions, saying, how are we going to deal with this? And what decisions do we need to make as a collection?
So one thing that we talked about in the past was around leadership, and this idea, or maybe Agile, has been presented to focus more on speed. Let's just do stuff fast. And that created chaos. It became more like a chaos of just let's put something out there, and then a lot of thrashing happening. So there wasn't a lot of like this intention around like, what is it that we're trying to solve, or what is it that we're trying to accomplish here? So there's no deliberation. And like you said, product design has that sort of deliberation and thinking deeply about things. So that's one aspect. And then the other aspect of it is more like, okay, we have other frameworks or other solutions that will give you the answer. Here are the answers to all the things that you might run into. And so that's another extreme. So it's either chaos or let's just go and do stuff and hopefully it works. And then the other end of the spectrum is we have all the answers to to everything so that we're going to have to spend time on all these documentation and things that may not be useful. So Agile 2, you had this subtitle, the Agile experiment was only a partial success. Agile now needs to pivot. So where do you see Agile pivoting? What is it pivoting to?
Well, the ideas in Agile 2 are not our ideas. The ideas in Agile 2 are taken from the community. These are ideas, if you talk to people who build stuff in an Agile way where they're getting stuff out rapidly and it works and their customers are happy. These ideas are the ideas that are in their heads. It's how they look at this stuff. The problem is those ideas, a lot of them are not part of the Agile narrative, if you will. You won't find them in books on Agile generally, unless, you'll find some of them in some books and some other, but opinionated books. One of my favorite books is a recent book by Klaus Leopold. I forget what the name of it is, but it's a really good book. It's non-technical, but he talks about that Agile is not just a team. It's the whole flow of delivery stream and customer-facing value stream. Those are two different things. And he talks about how you need to look at that whole thing.
Is it Rethinking Agile?
It is.
Okay.
It is Rethinking Agile.
So you talked about a lot of things that are missing in Agile. It was a lot of good ideas initially, values and principles, and now
where's it going?
Where's it going? Especially there is a leadership component. It's critical, but it has become diluted or not concrete.
And leadership is everything. So where's Agile going? None of us know where things are going, but the ideas in Agile 2 are ideas from the people who know how to do this. Another thing is that, the Agile community, my editor at Pearson described, and this is a guy who's a senior editor and goes to Agile conferences all the time. He described the word he used was insular. And the Agile community, and I'm not talking about everybody, there are Agile coaches who are fantastic. I know some, but the community as a whole, it is very much in a bubble. It really is. It's gotten better. It really has gotten better, but still, and so I like to ask Agile coaches, have you actually asked programmers what they think of Agile? Yesterday, I just wrote an article today about this. There was a post in Slashdot. Slashdot is a programmer forum. It's mostly programmers who read it. And a lot of very smart people. You see the replies and they're talking about physics and all kinds of things. And someone asked, it's 20 years, has Agile lived up to its goals? And I went through, Slashdot has a response rating system. So the most popular response is made more prominent. And so I looked at the top 10. Every one of the top 10 was highly negative about Agile. Now, these are programmers. So how many Agile coaches actually ask programmers, what do you think of Agile? And really listen to what they say. It was created for programmers originally, expanded to other things, but originally it was created for programmers. But the Agile community kind of talks to itself. And there's a lot of pushback on a lot of kind of Agile culture things. It's not necessarily the Agile manifesto. It's just Agile is much more than the manifesto. It's Agile team rooms and Scrum and all the things. When someone says Agile, it's all the stuff you think about. That's the reality. No one owns the word Agile. Dave Thomas does not own the word Agile. It's left his control. And the reality today is Agile. It's a colloquial term, Agile with a capital A, and it means a whole bunch of stuff. It's a quilt. It's more than Agile manifesto. It's the community. It's the different practices that are popular. It's the way of thinking. It's the people. It's so Agile really needs, I think, to pivot, because if you talk to who it was really created for, which was programmers, but if you expand that, maybe product developers or people who are impacted by it, not Agile coaches. They're supposed to be the leaders and facilitators. Talk about the people doing the work. A lot of them, like the majority of them, don't like it. And that could be for a couple of reasons. One, the core ideas are wrong, which I don't think. I think the core ideas are sound. Two is, and this is what the Agile community often will say, they'll say, well, you're doing it wrong. But if like almost everybody's doing it wrong, can you blame them? Is it their fault?
Who's doing it right?
There are some people doing it right. But if it's so hard to do, then we must be missing something. We're making it too hard for them or something, and so it doesn't mean the core ideas are wrong either. It just means we're not explaining it right, or we're not teaching it right, or we're not coaching it right, or we're not setting them up for success. Or maybe the core ideas are missing some things, or maybe the core ideas are being misunderstood, which comes back to us, Agile coaches. So something's wrong. Something's wrong in the Agile community that everybody is doing it wrong. For the book, there's so many companies, and a challenge with case studies is you have to look at the organization. And I don't have time to go and interview 100 CIOs and their people, at 100 different organizations, do some kind of academic analysis. Agile 2 was created by 15 people, and it's a practitioner-based initiative, just like the original Agile manifesto. It's 15 experienced people with diverse background. What do they think? And it really tracks very closely to what people in the community seem to do this well. And a lot of these ideas have been tested with articles. A lot of articles have been written over the last 5-6 years about many of these things, and comments have been examined very closely and trends looked at. So, Agile 2 is not something that just popped up. It's been in the works. And I think that if we're doing it wrong, what is it we need to fix? And I do believe the core ideas of Agile are sound. I just think, number one, they're oversimplified, this over that. That doesn't tell you much.
To give an example, I was looking at values of Agile, this word over versus and. So thoughtfulness and prescription. So it's the and most of the time what happened, or at least that's my assessment of how people misinterpret the over. So they either go one extreme or the other, right? So that
Polarity
balance, it's a polarity thinking, and then they don't balance based on the context on the environment they're in. But I think the word and can potentially provide a little bit more understanding around the balance that, you need both. You don't need this over this. You need both. And that balance is dependent on the context or the problem that we're trying to solve in this environment that we're in.
Yeah. And, Bob Martin insists that when they came up with those values, that the over was very intentionally, that they discussed that a lot. And they really meant to say it's not one or the other. It's both, but with a slight preference for one. They really were intent on there being a balance. And you're right. Those two sides are often turned into a polarity. We only do this. So documentation is a good example. In early Agile days, there was this common kind of belief that to be Agile, you shouldn't create any documentation. That's not true today, but it was in the early days. It was very common that Agile coaches or XP coaches back then said, you don't create documentation. And, programmers knew that doesn't make sense, but then a portion of the community, the XP community, started claiming, well, code should be self-documenting, which is absolute nonsense. Code is not self-documenting because, code, your comments can provide, but code is pretty low level. It doesn't describe high level structure. And especially today with distributed systems, it's a real problem. But like tests, there are a lot of people who claimed for a long time, and some still do, that unit tests define your behavior. And they absolutely do not. Unit tests define special cases. And to reverse engineer the intention from a whole set of unit tests is like a math puzzle. Why would you treat that as documentation? The whole point of documentation is to help someone else learn quickly what you're trying to do. What the best tool for that is a narrative and or a diagram that is written in human terms, in human readable terms, not a bunch of code. So tests do not define behavior. I'll debate that with anybody, because there are people who hold on to that, but I welcome anyone to debate that. So there's this kind of dogma that arose around different ideas and different practices that took a lot of Agile ideas to extremes. The extremes are what's the problem. And I think, I kind of blame extreme programming because my own company, we adopted extreme programming, but I personally don't like a lot of the practices. They don't work for me. I'm a big believer in test first approaches, but not test driven development, which is unit test level. I don't work that way. It's a bottom up approach. I work top down. I don't like to say, well, what are the inputs and outputs? I don't care. I want to know, what are we trying to do?
Yeah.
And then I create structures that enable us to do that effectively. And then the last thing I do is I figure out what are the best inputs and outputs based on how we're going to use this. Inputs and outputs are the last thing I worry about.
I know when we talked offline, we were talking about what is enabling this behavior of extremes, to either chaos or knowing everything in details. And I think one of the things that we discussed is asking the right questions. You're saying, what are we trying to do? So starting with some goal or intention around what is it that we're trying to accomplish can help in terms of deciding how to invest our time and energy.
And the whole aspect of product design, at least this is something the Agile community has realized as a gap. And a lot of people within the Agile community are trying to add design back in through UX thinking and so on. But we had concepts of participatory design many decades ago, 4 decades ago, and those ideas, had been put into practice and were fairly commonplace, and then they kind of got blown out of the water. Agile methodologies like Scrum kind of impose this one-directional flow on you, with an Uber, like a user proxy dictating features. And, Jeff Sutherland himself is always writing about do twice the work in half the time. Like he's like obsessed with programmer productivity. And we should instead be thinking about, are we solving the user's problem, their job to be done? Do we understand them? Are they actually helping to design the product so that it empowers them rather than replaces them? Are they part of the design process? And is there a collaboration? And is the technical side a collaborator? Or is it just taking orders? Build this, build that? Because a lot of times today, most companies today, big companies, their business operates on a technology platform, whether it's software or hardware. Tesla, it's a hardware technology. Their factories are their technology platform. Amazon, it's their website, and their whole automated delivery ecosystem. So the technology, it's just like JetBlue says, we're a technology company that flies people. Capital One, we're a technology company that does banking. So the technology platform today is the backbone of the business. So you have to know how that whole thing works.
You mentioned earlier that asking developers, and frankly, people in general, like how is this process working for you? What is missing and what's not working is important because, like you said, Agile started in the technical domain, and really most organizations now are, whether they like it or not, are in technology because everything is driven by technology, and they need to understand to some extent how that works. So that leads me to this idea of keeping things busy or productivity, like, measuring productivity in a way that is hard. And I don't know if it's even necessary to measure this kind of metric. It doesn't say anything. So what would be in other ways or other questions to ask that will bring more clarity around the work that we're doing, rather than, like you said, becoming more of a feature factory? Let's just pump out features and artifacts and deliverables.
Yeah, well, the actual users, whatever they are, they need to be involved. So, they're part of the conversation on an ongoing basis. And, not everything that you measure is a number. A lot of times measurement can be subjective. And you can often turn subjective measurement into a number by doing like a survey. If you ask, several constituents of your customer, what do you think about this and that? Then you can collect some actual numerical metrics, from their subjective beliefs. But you should be looking at outcomes and customer happiness and things like that. You should also be looking at the one metric that matters and the metrics that matter for your delivery stream, your capability delivery stream, and your customer value stream. The customer value stream is how operationally value is sent to customers, created using your systems. The capability delivery stream is how you create those systems, how you create and maintain those systems and augment those systems over time. So those are two different flows, and people need to have an understanding of both. And you need to be looking at as a system. You need to be, you shouldn't be measuring everything all the time. Maybe you should be measuring, but you shouldn't be paying attention to all your metrics all the time. You should have a few that you're watching, areas that are a problem or that you're trying to improve. Because, if you're worried about time to market, there are probably a few metrics that really kind of are the constraint, the TSC constraint, that's holding up your time to market. Those are the ones you should be watching. And it might change from month to month. You should be always reflecting on your flow and on what the constraints are and how well things are working, feedback you're getting, and always kind of modeling the system, and this is not like create some big model somewhere. This is like create a shared understanding of how things are flowing and what the constraints are. In terms of actual metrics, I'm a fan of lean metrics, but I wouldn't just pull metrics out of the hat. I'd first say, do we understand our system? Do we understand our system, and do we understand what it is we want to improve about our system? And that will lead us to what we should be measuring and actually paying attention to.
So start with where we are and figure out how it works before we try to improve it, because if we don't know how it works, how will we improve it?
No, don't get me started on that. I mean, there's a huge dysfunction today. There's a huge dysfunction today in organizations, and that managers often don't understand what's going on. Really, they think they do, and they do it they do to a level, but it's not a deep level. What they often don't understand is how to improve it, because they don't really understand what's going on. They understand the basic flow, but they don't understand like how the kind of what's it called, perturbation model for their system. And part of the reason for that is because they don't make time to discuss it. It's so common today. If you try to set up a meeting with a manager, their calendar's full for the next month, so they don't have time to have a real conversation about anything.
Exactly.
You can't say, hey, can we talk about this and really talk it through? They don't have time. So they can't have deep conversations, and that leads to bad decision making. And the reason their calendars are full, when companies adopt Agile, what happens is their calendars then fill up, and they often are perplexed. Why is that? And the explanation often is, well, you have the old meetings plus the new meetings. But it actually doesn't get too much better. It gets a little better. But their calendars stay full. And it's because now everything's cross-functional. So now a manager has to go to, instead of 6 meetings, they have to go to 12 meetings, because they have to know what other groups are doing. And all those meetings are scheduled as standing meetings every Tuesday at 3:00, every Tuesday at 4:00, every Tuesday at 5:00, every Wednesday at 9 a.m., every Wednesday at 10 a.m. Their calendars are full of standing meetings, and their admins find little slots and fill them in, and so they're going from standing meeting to standing meeting. And that's the problem.
It's like a game
standing meetings
Tetris.
are the problem. Really, standing meetings usually are used for communication. You should not, meetings are very costly. You're taking people, highly paid people, and putting them in a room just to share information. You should not be using meetings for communication. And if you don't use them for communication, if you implement through cultural norms, other behaviors for communication, you can eliminate a lot of standing meetings. You shouldn't eliminate them all. Some standing meetings are important for relationships and just being FaceTime and things, but a lot of standing meetings could be eliminated if you shift behaviors culturally to other forms of like information radiator type things, but let people know that they have to look at stuff. That's the leadership has to set the tone for that. And standing meetings shouldn't be used for communication. And if managers had more time on their calendar, they would be able to say, hey, I have an hour on Thursday. Let's talk this through. I want to really understand what's going on there. And those are the kinds of conversations they need to be having to really understand things.
The key word here, deep conversations or deep thinking. That's usually that deep work doesn't occur if you are constantly on the run. It's very disruptive. I was working with a team, and one of the developers, the technical lead, he was talking about this problem that they were trying to figure out, and it required some collaboration between different team members, and they wanted to get together and offer to facilitate the conversation, and they were all on board. But then a couple weeks later, nothing happened. So I talked to him about what's going on, and he showed me his calendar, and I like back to back meetings most of the week. So they couldn't find time to have that deep conversation. And most developers I've worked with in the past, they do work after hours, because that's when they can get some time to focus and concentrate on doing deep work, because most of the day they're just running around in meetings and, like you said, updates or standing meetings that may be summarized in an email rather than having a real-time meeting.
And for developers on teams, I'm not a fan. I think the individual should decide, but for me, if I were on a team, I wouldn't want to have stand-ups. I wouldn't, because I don't care. I don't want to know what everybody's working on every day. I don't. I do want to know how it's all going to work together. So when a new initiative for a new feature set or however you chunk it, or whenever you come up with your themes for some period of time or whatever, when that starts, I do want to get together with the other people involved and say, how is this going to work? What are we really trying to do? What's it really have to do? What are the customers really asking for? And how's it going to work? Let's figure out how it's going to work, and then we'll figure out who's going to do what. I'll implement this feature, you implement that feature, and we'll put them in a backlog, but we have to have in our heads how it all is going to fit together somehow. Not at a detail level, just conceptually. We'll address the details as we go, but we need to have in our heads the model and the approach. And during development, if that changes or something changes that impacts that, that's when I want to know. Mm-hmm. And I do want to know how people are progressing as details start to evolve. As you're building things, you start to add more details, and that model gets sharpened up. And so I do like to have every few days, like, let's get together for an hour and let's tell each other how we're building our stuff. And we'll find discrepancies. Like, oops, you're doing it that way? I didn't think you were going to do it that way. We better adjust. Mm-hmm. I do want that. So kind of like a technical design discussion every few days. And if something changes, like a customer feedback says, look, actually, we don't like this, I want to know that. We should probably have a little meeting around if that happens. Or if someone has a problem, an impediment, why is it an impediment? The Agile community always has to use a new word. Why isn't it problem? It has to be a different word. So we have to call it an impediment. If someone has an impediment that has a broader impact, I want to know about that. So those are events where those events should trigger discussions as soon as they happen, not wait till the next stand-up. Yeah. It would be like, okay, when's a good time for everybody to talk about this? Okay, maybe this afternoon at 3. That way I'll have finished most of what I'm working on today and I won't be disrupted. Afternoon at 3, we'll get together and talk about this new thing that came up. But this everyday stand-up is, to me, so disruptive because, no matter when you schedule it, like say you schedule it at 9. So I usually sit down, well, we're all working at home now, but I sit down at my desk usually either at 7 or 9, depending, because I make breakfast for my wife. And so usually we have breakfast, but if she's busy, I'll sit down at my desk right away. So anyway, 9 o'clock, I don't want to have a stand-up meeting, because I'm just getting my thoughts together. I don't know what I'm going to do today. Yeah. I haven't mentally processed, I haven't reflected on what happened yesterday and why is that, and kind of done my task list of how I'm going to approach the day. I'm not ready for a stand-up. If the stand-up's at 11, and then suppose I start my day at 9, I'm going to be very leery of getting deep into, if I'm developing, which is, developing is, what do they call it? Where, I forget, some author distinguished between, like focused work versus like work where you're reacting. I forget.
Yeah, deep work versus shallow work. Something.
That's Cal Newport's term, but there's another term. But anyway, that's the idea. And so, like managers do the shallow work, which is not intended to be like derisive or anything. It's just where you're reacting. You're just using what you already know, like to make decisions, but you're not building something. You're not like writing a document or creating code where you have to focus deeply for hours with small breaks in between crafting, which is when you're crafting, just interruptions are very disruptive
and costly.
You can't multitask when you're crafting. If you're crafting and you have a stand up at 11 and at 9, you like check your email and figure out what you're going to do. It's 9:30 before you actually know what you're going to do. And then you have to respond to me. It's 9:45 before you really get going. And you're going to be very leery of getting deep into your work because there's a stand-up coming up. And then the stand-up is 11, it lasts 15 minutes, and it goes over 5 minutes, so it's 20 minutes, but then lunch is coming up. So you're not going to get into anything either. So your morning is blown. This 15-minute meeting kind of like wrecks your whole morning. It's very costly.
Yeah, it is costly. And I like I'm sure there are multiple ways to label or to call this, but Cal Newport would call it like deep work and shallow work and how you need some long blocks of time to be able to focus and concentrate. And I know even like in some ways in the community, we've been talking about the cost of context switching and all that stuff. But when it comes down to meetings, we still have all these different like little meetings and breaking up the day in so many short portions that it doesn't give us enough time to do deliberate and deep work.
Exactly. It ruins your ability to go deep, which means number one, you're spinning your wheels. You're not really, because you don't become productive unless you get in the zone, which means you've built a rich, highly decorated mental model of your problem. And it takes time to build that model. And the model is kind of preserved in your memory over time a little bit, but every time you resume work, you have to sharpen it up again. And that takes time. And if you're interrupted, depending on how long you're interrupted, it wrecks part of the model. It's like pieces of it fall off. And you have to revisit those pieces to sharpen those again and to get back into that zone. And if the interruption is for a while, it fractures a lot of the model. So interruptions keep you from being able to go deep and be really productive and solve hard problems.
It's really not fulfilling to keep getting that interruption happening. Like I know we talked earlier about lean metrics and the idea of flow, but there is another type of flow, which is getting in the zone, like you said,
Right.
the mental flow where you just forget everything else and because you're so focused on solving a problem or doing deep work. I'm reading this time I'm reading the book Thinking Fast and Slow. Also, that's another good read. Besides the deep work, Cal Newport. But yeah, this is, and shallow work, like you said, it's not meant to be like an insult. It's more like, they're more reactive and that's needed sometimes. And the other, system where you have to have some sort of deeper, reflection and solving problems. That's, you can't solve hard problems with the reactionary mode. Like, you're in reactionary mode. That's not possible. That's probably another topic for another day. But
well, that's actually a really interesting topic because, that kind of shallow work, which there is another terminology for that that's older than Cal Newport, that has to do with like crafting versus something. I forget what it is, but recently there's been a lot of progress in machine learning with very deep, really large neural network models, having billions of parameters. And models like that have been able to do amazing things like write articles or write articles that read like they're written by a human and make sense. Like you give it a sentence and it writes a whole article from the sentence. And the article reads just like a person wrote it, and it's logical. And the amazing thing about that is that these networks don't really understand what they're doing. They're doing it through a very sophisticated pattern generation system. And when people converse with each other, that's kind of what they're doing. That they're not really thinking deeply. They're kind of using a generative model in their head. Information, that sentence comes in and then they kind of respond, and they might respond in several ways in their head and compare and then look at which is better. But they're not thinking deeply. It's a very input response kind of interaction, which is, you're not using your full brain when you do that.
Yeah.
To use your full brain, you have to create a new model that where you integrate information, and then you iteratively try to craft a new models that fits all the information, so that represents your new understanding of a collection of disparate information. So thinking deeply requires creating a new model, which is what people do not do when they have conversations. So It's a whole different thought process.
I know there's a model, I can't remember, but it's based on the art of thought, and incubation needs to happen before coming back to the conversation. And most people are trying to solve everything in just one conversation. And just because we need to be productive, I mean, I don't know what's the point, but really you need to have like step back, incubate and integrate what all these inputs, and then come back.
Yes, what you're doing is you're building a new model, I mean and you can't do that in real time. You have to do that through a process of reflection. So, I think that's one of the areas where I think the Agile Manifesto is actually wrong. Most of the Agile Manifesto, I would say it's not wrong. It's just people have taken it to extremes, and plus there's a lot missing, or it's been misinterpreted. You have to be kind of very experienced to interpret it well. But there's one statement that I actually feel is wrong, because it's an absolute statement. It's the statement that says face-to-face communication is the best form of communication. That's not true, because it's an absolute. And as an absolute, it is not true. Face-to-face communication is very effective for exchanging simple things. And it is effective for working through something where people have already built a rich model in their head, for comparing models. But But face-to-face communication is not useful if someone has not yet built that rich model. What is much more effective is, well, people differ. I mean, some people want to hear, because what you need to do, effective communication is not an event, it's a process. It takes place over time about complex things. And you need talking and listening, and you need reading and writing, and you need thinking. You need thinking. That's what you're talking about, the thinking part. And what happens if some people take information in better if it's communicated verbally, other people like me take information in better if they read it. I'm self-taught. I couldn't follow what teachers were saying in school up until 10th grade. I realized, I can read the textbook. And then I taught myself calculus, and I taught myself everything else. And I've been entirely self-taught ever since I went through college and grad school, just reading everything. So some people integrate information better if they read it. And those tend to be the natural writers. And if you're dealing with something complex, it's very often what works for people is to disseminate their thoughts in writing, have people read that. And then what you do when you read it is you're comparing it with the mental model you've built, and you're trying to find differences. And then if you get together in person, you can discuss those differences. But you have to, on your own, build the mental model. That takes quiet reflection when no one's talking, where you're integrating information and you're trying to build this model, and you're checking, is the model predictive? Based on that model, would I predict that this happens, and does that agree with the actual evidence? And you keep adjusting the model until it becomes accurately predictive. That takes time. You can't do that in real time while you're talking to people.
It's that shared understanding again. It's shared understanding, trying to get people close to understanding each other's perspective, and then kind of converge on something. That divergence need to happen first, right? And then you can converge on something.
Yes.
But really, you're talking about this different learning modalities for different people, and I know that's another topic that we could explore, and maybe part 2 of this podcast. But I really enjoyed talking to you, Cliff. I think a lot of the things that you mentioned are very important and useful, and it's great to see the next iteration of the Agile ideas moving forward. Is there anything else that you would like to add or share before we wrap up?
Yeah, I just want to make it clear that, Agile 2 is not presumptuous as like being the new Agile. We called it Agile 2 to get people's attention so they would know we were directly addressing the Agile community. But, we feel the Agile Manifesto has its place. It's a valuable, thoughtful document. No document's perfect. It's got some good ideas in it. You have to be thoughtful about it. You can't just implement it. But it's just a set of ideas. It's not someone's Bible. It's just a set of ideas. It's not perfect. And, Agile 2 is an attempt to add additional ideas and maybe pivot on some of the Agile ideas to the narrative, to the conversation. And it does represent a hard-won consensus among 15 very experienced people. So we think it's a set of good ideas. We don't expect everyone agrees with everything in it. It's just a set of ideas. And they're not rules. They're just ideas. They're things to consider.
I think that's a good approach. And what's a good way to learn more about it? I know the book, obviously, the publishing the Agile 2 book. Is there any other place for people
the
to
website is agile2.net, but it's not good to learn about something from a website. I mean, the website is where we put the content that the Agile 2 team came up with. And it's not just a set of principles. That each principle has an entire thought process behind it. There's a lot of content there. We didn't just write down like, we think this and we think that. We wrote down, we think this because, and there's a rich set of stuff for every principle. But the book was written for the purpose of making the case and explaining the core ideas. It's not a textbook. It's designed to be very readable, and it is kind of an in-depth book, but it's designed to be kind of a smooth or easy read. There's a lot of case study type content in it. I would point someone to the book.
I'm looking forward to reading it, and again, I enjoyed our conversation and happy you were able to make it, and looking forward for a part 2, hopefully sometime in the future.
Thank you, Sal. It was my pleasure. I enjoyed it very much.
Hey, thank you for listening. I hope this conversation gave you something to think about or take action on. Remember, take action and get clarity, then repeat.